And I'm delighted that we are now joined by the rest of our panel to give us some really wide-ranging kind of perspectives on digital trade from a North American perspective, a US and Canada perspective. So we have Anthony Phillipson, who is Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for North America. We have Darren Smith, who is Director of Services Trade for Global Affairs Canada. We have Aaron excuse me, I'm going to make a mess of that, my pronunciation, but Aaron Venkataraman, I hope I close to being correct, who is Counselor to the Secretary of Commerce at the US Department of Commerce. We have Susan Aronson, who's Research Professor at International Affairs at the George Washington University. And we have Ashley Schillingsberg, who's Director for Federal Government Relations at eBay. So to all of you for joining us. And Anthony, I wondered if we could perhaps start with you in terms of the UK perspective in the US, in terms of where we are really, in terms of our ability to kind of push forward the boundaries on digital trade.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thanks for the chance to join this panel. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and hearing the views of others, because it's very much a partnership approach between the UK, US and Canada, including with the industry and especially also with members of Congress. And it's great to see Congresswoman Dalbene. I'd just like to say thank you for our engagement recently with Minister Greg Hands, our Trade Policy Minister. I know that he really enjoyed the discussion. I mean, I think the UK sees itself as a world leader in digital trade. It's a hugely important part of our economy. And indeed, digital trade, I think, and data flows, etc., they underpin so much of the economic engagement between the UK and the rest of the global economy, and probably especially here in North America. So, you know, we're approaching this on a number of levels, and maybe working from the top. You know, we're very engaged in WTO discussions, discussions within the OECD on issues like digital services taxes, which we think are hugely important. And it's great to see the engagement from the US, the new US administration on that, but there's still quite a long way to go in those discussions, but we're really committed to working with our US and Canadian partners on that. The G7 is another venue for these discussions, and we're looking forward to welcoming the President and the Prime Minister of Canada to Cornwall in just a few weeks, where we'll be able to talk about this. And it's also been part of both the digital and the trade tracks that run underneath that summit process. And then, of course, there's our free trade agreements. And we've already signed a new agreement with Japan. I'm sure you probably talked about that earlier in the program. And here in the US, we are looking to make progress on an FTA with the administration. We got through 5 rounds with the previous one, including a digital chapter, also including an SME chapter, because I think, again, the intersection between the digital piece and the SMEs is so important in this. And the new US administration, quite understandably, is reviewing where they've got to and how it matches against President Biden's priorities. We think there's a lot of synergy between the UK and US in this space, so we're looking forward to making progress on that. In the meantime, we're also going to keep working away with other partners in the US, including the Department of Commerce, and especially at state level, because one thing that the US is not when it comes to this is a single market. And some of the issues that our companies face with sort of the different regulations between different states is important. And then, of course, in Canada, you know, a lot of focus in the recent months about rolling over the UK piece of the Canada-EU trade agreement, but also with a very firm commitment taking that forward into the future and an advanced UK-Canada trade and investment piece. The areas, I mean, just to sprint through them, you know, we're looking to address open digital market flows, data localization, consumer and business safeguards, digital trading systems, international cooperation, global governance. I mean, those are headlines of some very, very big topics. But the key thing is it's about partnership, as I say, UK and US and UK and Canada. US and Canada, of course, have their own relationship through USMCA. That had quite an ambitious digital chapter, which we studied with great interest. So I think it's a huge exciting area. Really great to have the chance to talk about it today, especially with techUK, and thank you for your blueprint on the future of the UK tech sort of economy, because again, the business inputs to this and having that partnership between business and the private sector and academia is just so important, especially in this space. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And there's lots I'd like to kind of return to in the course of the discussion. But if I could move, Aaron, I'm very, very interested in terms of the Department of Commerce perspective on where you see the opportunities and perhaps some of the the boundaries on some of the discussions as well.
Sure. Thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I think I would first say, rather, before getting into some of the specifics, just step back for a minute. We're at the beginning of a new administration. We're emerging, hopefully, from a devastating pandemic. This is a historic moment for many reasons, and in that sort of time frame, I mean, really, just stepping back for a minute to think about how should we be approaching issues of trade and technology going forward. And I think it might be useful to just highlight what seemed to us at the Commerce Department, three key principles that animate sort of our approach to engaging on these questions in this new administration. I think the first really is our shared values. Getting the path right on trade and technology is really likely to happen when we identify and embrace our shared values. And this is where obviously our and like-minded partners matter most. This is the group of countries that are really right precisely because those shared values and the commitment to democracy and individual liberties underpin what should really be understood as a largely shared approach to trade and technology. We know there's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of dramatic stories about conflict in this area, but I think it's one of those situations where there is such a shared approach, and that there is such a shared ethos underpinning our behavior that the narrative on those differences becomes unnecessarily exaggerated, and actually ends up becoming a false narrative. And I think it's important to remember that the shared approach that we all have really does reflect a commitment to an open, accessible, and transparent global trade and tech framework that ultimately will be capable of delivering prosperity to all of our people. So I think that's, for us, a bit of a North Star. First of all, let's level set and remember that we are among friends. We are friends and family. We approach these issues in very much the same way. Our areas of commonality vastly outnumber our areas of difference. So let's not let our areas of difference drive the relationship. The second thing I would maybe point to is making sure that we are delivering on the promise of global technology. Understandably, there's a lot of focus on the potential concerns with technology, whether it be connection with privacy or security or competition. And of course, I think as policymakers, it's not only perfectly appropriate, but it is in fact incumbent upon us to be aware of those and other implications of technology and determine how to best advance the interest of our communities in the face of those implications. At the same time, however, I think we really should keep in the front of our minds that technology has contributed so much to the world in terms of productivity, connectivity, economic growth, and opportunity. And that the beauty of it is that there is still so much potential left untapped, really because we continue to have more and more entrepreneurs around the world that are continuing to innovate. And so tapping into, I think, that potential really is going to require us as policymakers to stay attuned to the impacts of technology, but without overlooking the promise of that technology. And I think let's say maybe in trade terms, this is going to require governments to recommit to rules that are based on clarity, predictability, and most importantly, interoperability, which we can talk a little bit more about later. But I do think it is important to bear in mind that we don't have to be naive. We don't have to stick our head in the sand. But we do have to recognize that technology has been a force for good in so many ways, and we shouldn't, much as we shouldn't let the negative narrative, undercut our shared values. We shouldn't let the negative, or the potentially negative implications of certain aspects of technology overshadow what the benefits really are if we harness it in the right way. And that, I think, would lead me to my final point here, which is, this administration could not be more committed to openness and inclusivity. And I think that applies with equal, if not more so, in these discussions on trade and technology. How can we, as we work together and cooperate in this space, ensure that tech continues and it is in fact accessible to and harnessed for the benefit of everyone? I think we know as a fact that there have been, the digital divide is as real as ever. One of the, among the devastating impacts of COVID has really been how it has highlighted and underscored and in some ways exaggerated that digital divide, both among countries and within countries. We see that here in the United States. That is a problem. And we cannot go about business as usual without taking that into account. So I think that is going to be a key element of our conversations going forward. Maybe I'll stop there for now.
Thanks so much. I think it's been a real feature of today, actually. That point around values. I think it's been a theme that we've heard in all of the discussions that we've had, focusing on the different regions through the course of the day. But also, the really important point that you made about kind of purpose as well. And I think sometimes, coming back to the potential of what we can achieve if we use this technology and apply this technology in a smart way, but also if we make these opportunities open to as many countries and businesses and communities around the world. And it really strikes me that, particularly when we think about the challenge of climate change, for example, if we're really going to unleash the kind of innovation that we need to drive down kind of carbon emissions, we're going to need things like international data flows. Because we want SMEs wherever they are around the world to be able to innovate in kind of positive ways. So I think it's kind of bringing this all back to this bigger purpose. I think is extraordinarily important. But also, let's agree on some fundamental principles of what should underpin all of this. So thank you very much. A really, really excellent intervention. I'd like to turn now to Darren to get the kind of Canadian kind of perspective. Please, Darren.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and pleasure to be with everyone here today. I'll echo some of the comments that have been made by some of the previous speakers in terms of the synergies that exist between Canada, the UK, and the US, and wholeheartedly, would echo the suggestion that we have a strong foundation to build off of as we move forward in terms of our collective work, in terms of trying to seek greater certainty and predictability for industries that are operating in the space, irrespective of the four that we're talking about, whether it be the WTO, whether it be in a regional or bilateral FTA context, or even another four like the G7 or even OECD. I think from Canada's perspective, we've learned a great deal on the subject matter over the course of the last number of years. When we look at even our FTA practice, we've come an extraordinarily long way, even within the last decade, where we would capture in the context of an e-commerce chapter, provisions dealing with prohibition on customs duties on electronic transmissions. That was our focus. Now we've gone so much further in terms of our work, and I think that over the course of the coming decade and more, we're going to see, I think, a lot of growth in this area, especially as we also contemplate the use of new or novel trade instruments like digital agreements themselves, standalone digital agreements as an instrument to actually advance our interests. So you have not only a multilateral and a regional bilateral instrument, you also have another standalone instrument, kind of like bilateral investment treaties, support work in the investment field. And so we're in a very exciting time, challenging at the same time, because we have a lot to sort through to make sure we have coherence in that respect as well. So the proliferation of these new types of instruments and initiatives is great, but we have to do it the right way and intelligently. Otherwise, it's going to make the life of industry and our consumers more miserable than it actually will be positive. So we have to do this the correct way. And I think part of that correct way is recognizing a couple of overarching elements. One is that I think that there's expectations from all, whether it be industry, civil society, labor organizations, academia experts, and others, that we achieve balance in our work. Balance in the sense that we're providing greater certainty and predictability for businesses that operate in this area, but at the same time we retain policy space required to ensure that we achieve other policy imperatives that are important to our constituencies, that reflect our values as countries, as democracies, in terms of promoting our advancing work in terms of human rights, promoting gender-based policies that ensure inclusion in our economy. Particularly for instance, for women entrepreneurs being a good example, but there's others that we can talk about as well. Obviously, respect various security imperatives, which obviously is, of course, a major part of our considerations at the same time. So there's this overall that we have to achieve, and it's not easy, especially when some of our work on the international negotiator by practice, how that runs up against various domestic imperatives. And in my world, running up against, I do more negotiating sometimes with my domestic departments than I do with my international trade partners. They're fun to deal with, but that's part of our work is, and I see Arun laughing. I think he knows what I mean. It's part of our part of reality, and I think when you take that to the next level, then what we can actually do through our trade agreements in this instance, it's again achieving that kind of aspect of balance in our work. For us, I think it's clear that we have to obviously tackle issues that help deal with potential market access impediments. That's important. We also have to do work that facilitates trade in this area, and there's lots that we can do in that respect as well. But I think a third pillar that continues to receive more and more attention, and something we have to be constantly aware of, is building consumer trust and confidence. And when that is eroded, that can have a major impact in terms of our capabilities to continue to see economic prosperity advance through digital transformation and such. So, we have to, I think, be mindful that, there's these kind of variables in play that we have to address adequately. And I think what we've done right now, we're at the stage where we've dealt with this in a very macro context. And we're going to see, I think, in the years that follow, we're going to continue to drill down on some of these issues. A good example, I think, would be for us in the Canadian context is that, we've begun the process to try to accede to the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement with New Zealand, Chile, and Singapore. We've commenced exploratory discussions with those three countries. And those of you who've looked at the DEPA will note that it includes modules that are not present actually in the modernized NAFTA agreement or the CPTPP or some of the other FTAs. Ideas in terms of digital inclusivity, the idea about doing more enhanced collaboration on emerging technologies like AI or fintech. SMEs, a key part of this equation is ensuring that small and medium-sized enterprises have the opportunity to compete on a global stage, and that's going to mean a strong focus on issues that are important, that allow for SME participation into international markets. And so these kinds of aspects have to be part of our consideration moving forward, and will probably be appearing more prominently within our context of our trade agreement, trade instruments. And that's going to be, I think, an interesting challenge for us, is that as this grows, how big does this chapter get? How big do these agreements get as we try to ensure coherence with other policy areas, whether it be competition policy, the subsidies, just some of the broader considerations around security or cybersecurity. Cybersecurity can work, I think, very well in the context of the US, Canada, and the UK, but So once you start going beyond those countries, it gets a little more challenging. And so we have to kind of recognize that as well. So there's a lot of, I think, interesting developments that are taking place in this space, and coherence as well between the international realm and the domestic realm is going to be really key. We're going through domestic reform processes in Canada. We have to make sure that coherence is there. That's going to be a challenge for some countries that perhaps have capacity constraints or expertise limitations, because otherwise problems can emerge. Unintended consequences can take place when policy imperatives in another area don't take into account the international trade component and what that can mean. So maybe I'll just end my comments at we're in a very exciting time. A lot of creativity and development is taking place in the sphere, but it's not going to be easy. There's going to be a lot of challenges ahead, and we have to be very mindful of the different, ways in which we can fail. Because if we don't keep those in mind, we won't succeed. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Darren. And I'm really struck by what you said there about SMEs. We had a number of SMEs on sessions earlier in the day, in looking at different markets, but each of them all described just how important and enabling clear rules are for them, and predictability, and they don't always have to be absolutely the best rules, but as long as they're clear and predictable, it can allow them a way in. But what they really struggle to deal with is the real ambiguities and uncertainties, where if it only works if you've got the resources of a really big a company to understand how to progress. So that really chimed with what some of us have been saying earlier on in the day. I'd now like to turn to Susan. I think we've had quite a lot of sort of quite optimistic in many ways, in terms of what our trade negotiating kind of colleagues have come forward with in the first of the session. Do you feel quite as optimistic about where we are, or the challenges that we face? You're just on mute there still, Susan. Yeah. Oh.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. I am optimistic, actually. And let me begin by talking about the United States, and then I'll speak generically about the WTO. In the United States, we see a broad rethinking of data governance, and it hasn't yet moved to digital trade. The hub that I work at maps the governance of data around the world at the national and international levels. And what we see is some nations have very coherent policies and have linked data strategies and data charters to digital trade. But the United States has not. In fact, we're just starting that process. So we are way behind. I begin with that to say that I do think that rethink at the national level, or that intensified thinking that we see in the EU, we see in China, we see in many countries, including Canada, it hasn't happened at the international level yet. And I'd like to posit a couple of things, if I could briefly. The Japanese government has called for data free flow with trust. And so how do you get that trust? All trade agreements are meant to build trust. But if you look at why people feel distrust online, they feel distrust because they're threatened by disinformation. They're freaking out about malware, cyber theft of personal information, etc. So I want to talk about what's in trade agreements and how that discussion on free flow with trust can be enhanced. So right now, all digital trade or e-commerce agreements, whether they're sectoral or they're part of a larger agreement such as USMCA or CUSMA, include these three provisions. Number one, free flow of data with certain exceptions for national security, social stability, etc. My concern with that is that can lead to a lot of protectionism. So you need trade disputes to resolve it, or you need clearer rules. Second part, trade agreements, every single one of them says enforce your own laws for privacy, spam, and consumer welfare. that does not foster interoperability. And many nations don't know how to govern personal data. And at a time of COVID-19, they may not have the funds to put towards that. So I would say we need to rethink that. Finally, there are two bans. There's a ban on performance requirements related to services delivered digitally and goods, and a ban on data localization. But those don't address the concerns of users. Again, to build trust in the data-driven economy, we need to address their concerns. So there are things that we can do that do not distort trade. One is we already have rules governing spam. Why not ban spam bots that foster disinformation? That's one idea. Another idea, think about how do you build trust in the regime? How do you involve people in discussing it? The UK has done a fabulous job, as has Canada, of building discussions with broad citizenry about how to build trust in data and data-driven change. The United States is behind on this. Okay, so I don't want to take too much more time. I have a ton of other ideas which I've had the opportunity to present in Canada. Thank you, Darren and colleagues, and in the UK, and I'm hoping to present them in the United States.
Thank you, Susan. One of the terms that came up in one of the previous sessions was in terms of the debate in relation to the free flow of data versus data protection was actually what we kind of know what we're all aiming towards here, which is the free flow of protected data, and that I thought it was quite an interesting way of presenting it in terms of coming back to that fundamental issue of trust, ensuring that that consumers can have the right level of trust. The question, of course, is how do we get there and get to that level of agreement around what that could actually mean. I'd like to now turn to Ashley Schillingsberg, who brings a perspective of really a global player, a global technology company that supports and enables consumers in markets right around the world, that has to deal with all of these differences in jurisdictions, all of these differences in regulatory approaches, but actually to really kind of get your perspective on that, the challenges and I suppose the opportunities.
Thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity and want to second a lot of what's already been said around the importance of looking at SMEs and inclusion and equity in looking at how we can craft digital trade policies. I think that often people think of digital trade as the purview of large multinationals. On eBay, what we've really discovered is that we have millions of micro multinationals. Our platform has always been about connecting sellers with buyers all over the world. We have 20 million sellers and 187 million active buyers globally in 190 markets. So eBay has already broken down a lot of the barriers to trade, a lot of the language barriers, issues like payments, and we've taken these small businesses out of local economies and brought them onto the global stage. So I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about why that's important, particularly right now, as like Erin said, we're starting to come out of the COVID economy and look at an equitable recovery for everyone in the US and globally as well. We looked at our data in the beginning of COVID in the US, the first 6 months after the lockdowns of March 2020, and we found that eBay-enabled small businesses in the United States grew 34%. That's the number of small businesses selling on eBay grew by 34% compared to the previous year, and their sales grew 38%. So when things shut down, obviously consumers went online, small businesses went online as well. And we anticipate that those trends are here to stay. Additionally, we already know that our small businesses are trading. Less than 1% of traditional businesses export. 96% of eBay small businesses are exporters. and they're exporting to an average of 16 different global markets. That's astounding. It's very difficult for a small business to do the market research to break into another market, again, particularly when there are language barriers or other issues, and really figure out how to integrate into supply chains in countries that they're not familiar with. A lot of small businesses spend a lot of time and money trying to do that. It's easy when you have these global marketplace platforms. So we take these issues really seriously, and we appreciate the work of everyone on the panel on these issues. We're really encouraged by a lot of these conversations. I don't think that we differ too much in terms of our goals of what we would like to see moving forward. Obviously, free data flows are important for eBay and for the small businesses on our platform. Regulatory certainty, predictability, and interoperability, as Erin said, it's really critical. When a small business sells something in another country and then has to scurry and figure out what all the different rules are that apply, those are all limitations. And we do our best to try to eliminate those. But if we really want to continue enabling this growth, that's really critical. We're encouraged, that there's been a lot of focus on an SME chapter in a US-UK possible free trade agreement. Those are super important. And our platform is a digital platform, but we enable trade in goods. And so I think I don't know how much conversation there's been around customs, but these are the issues that really matter for small e-commerce business. Capacity on minimum thresholds and making sure customs procedures are clear and expedited for small business traders are really important, and a little bit of outside the scope of what's traditionally digital trade, but that's one of the big ones for us. So I'll end there, but thank you. I really appreciate this conversation.
Thank you. And yes, I mean, I think it's been, from a UK perspective, we've seen, through the course of the pandemic, this really dramatic increase in the digitization of firms. And I think that correlation between digitized businesses and businesses that then go on to start trading internationally, I think is really exciting, because I think once you're on that digitization journey, you're also on a trajectory towards potentially accessing more international markets. So I think that is really interesting. I think on the product side, I mean, I think certainly, and again through the course of the discussion today, whilst a huge proportion of digital trade is services, it absolutely depends also on the ability of goods to flow. And one of the big opportunities, I think, is from our perspective is around kind of what happens at the border. And that there is so much potential to use digital technology to take out that friction at the border, that can make all of those kind of customs processes work much more efficiently and effectively. And we see that as an absolutely kind of critical part of the digital trade discussion. Anthony, I wonder if I could come back to you in terms of from what you've heard from colleagues on the panel. Just kind of what you think that means for the trajectory of what can be achieved from a UK perspective in terms of really opening up digital trade, but not simply in terms of what we can achieve through agreements, but also what can be achieved in terms of just trade facilitation, but also kind of just getting more discussions going around these big regulatory questions and building sort of understanding and trust, just by talking more.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much indeed to the other panelists. I thought it was fascinating. Really enjoyed listening to that, and I agree with all of it. I mean, it's quite hard to sort of break this down. I mean, these are sort of big, complex topics, but I mean, maybe starting where you finished. I mean, the crucial thing is setting up the necessary conversations. And at the risk of being grossly simplistic, I mean, sort of think about this in my tiny mind is that we have various places where we can already think about making trade rules, WTO, OECD, we've talked about those. The question I think we have to challenge ourselves with are those organizations, and this is not to disparage those organizations, but are they fit for purpose for having these types of discussions? Are we really going to achieve, to reach a multilateral agreement in the WTO on some of these big complex issues that are seen in very different ways by different countries? Including, if we're honest, we talk a lot about sort of opportunity, and others are thinking about how they can use these in a sort of slightly different means. And if people haven't seen it, the UK government published a document a few weeks ago which we called an integrated review, which is basically our sort of modern version of what we used to call a defence and security review. We publish one about every 5 years, and this one brings together sort of the defence and security piece, but with the economic piece and indeed the development piece. And I think tech runs through the heart of all of it, because tech has been noted, and I completely agree, is going to be the way that we get out of things like global pandemics, get through climate change, etc., etc. But tech is also a considerable threat to our societies. We believe in open economies and open societies, but others are using that against us to seed disinformation, to foster distrust, and indeed to attack companies and in some cases governments. And we've seen this here in the US with the pipeline a few weeks ago, sort of at the back end of last year. And how we respond to that, I think, is something that is an essential part of this question as well. If I can also just pick up one other thing that was said, this sense of how you get the right balance between innovation and regulation in order to both create and sustain consumer trust. Because I think that's absolutely vital in this area. If we get that balance wrong, either we overtip into regulation, we crush innovation too early, that's not good. But if we just let everything rip and you end up with consumers feeling that they aren't being protected, then you start to lose that sense of trust. And I think the UK is a really interesting place to look at this from, because I actually think we have a population that embraced the digital economy probably earlier than others. And then we've all been forced into embracing it in the context of COVID. And I think that balance of innovation and regulation, I think we've done some really interesting things in two areas in particular, just to highlight them. First of all, in fintech, with the approach around the regulatory sandbox, piloting different types of regulation at sort of pilot level, sort of micro level, and then scaling up when we can see what works. But also in areas like AI, where we've done a lot of work, I think, around the ethics of AI and how we handle the discussions around that. Because, to be really honest, we don't really know what the questions are, let alone what the answers are. And if we leap too quickly to the answers and skip the question stage, then we're going to have a problem. So, let's talk about these issues in the areas that exist, but then let's think about whether we need to create new ones, and whether that's joining digital economic partnerships, or I think earlier you will have heard about our digital and tech sort of network in Asia Pacific. It's all about, as I say, creating the right conversations with the right people in order to, I think, just to stay one step ahead of that sense of, what's the next big challenge? And there will be things that we don't anticipate. If you told me 15 months ago, as we went into the pandemic, that 15 months later we would still be having to engage through Teams, I think I might A, have been quite depressed, and B, been a bit skeptical. But this was an unseen, and tech again will get us through it. But we need to think about how we keep just sort of joining those dots. There was one other point I wanted to make, and I think it really goes to Aaron's point, if I might, about shared values. US, UK, and Canada. Actually, I would add Australia and New Zealand to that as well through the Five Eyes. Because again, sustaining those conversations, but also bringing others into it. I served in Singapore earlier. I think they've got a huge amount to offer in this space. South Korea, Japan, etc. Which is where I think again, we're inviting Australia and South Korea, along with India, South Africa, to the G7. That again is another fora, but we just need to keep creating the conversations, which is why I think events like this are so important. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that the institution building point is really interesting. We at techUK, we were very involved both in terms of thinking about how you develop sandboxes for AI ethics, sort of pushing for the establishment of the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation in the UK, also the Ada Lovelace Institute in the UK, as places that could do that forethought and trying to think forward, because this real sense of the future's coming at us very, very quickly, and we need to do a lot of thinking around some of these new emerging challenges, and that thinking has to be will have to be translated into regulation, in a relatively short period of time, which I think sort of brings me back to this thing of and that's why we think from a technology perspective, the more fora that we have for international discussions around those, the roadmap in terms of regulation, and how we navigate all of these very significant societal and security challenges and all the rest. The more we can kind of progress on the trade side. Aaron, you'd like to come in? Oh, you're on mute, Aaron. Sorry.
Try that again. Over.
Yeah.
Great. Wanted to chime in on sort of recognizing that there are so many areas here that are nascent, that where we are collectively and individually, frankly, struggling to find our way forward. But can we seize that as an opportunity, right? I think, part of me really does believe that we're lacking a bit of creativity when we keep talking about trade rules, in the sense that I almost feel like we need a sandbox mentality to approach government dialogues on this, and not just think about trade agreements, right? Because I think the very fact that we are all learning as we are doing creates tremendous opportunity for information sharing, for learning from each other, particularly in where we have those shared values. And so our starting point remains the consistent across our shared values jurisdictions. We should be working together in forms of policy cooperation, regulatory cooperation, even just understanding, technological understanding. And there's so much that is, and as we all know, that the private sector is operating at some sort of speed of Moore's law gone exponential. I mean, it's just really like things are moving so quickly, and again, it poses challenges, but also creates tremendous opportunities. But we really should, and to Anthony's point about getting ahead of this, right? The problem, as we all know, with trade agreements are fantastically important, and we all know that. But you can't help but feel that trade agreements consistently fight yesterday's battles, or frankly, in the tech space, sometimes last decade's battles. Things aren't moving so quickly. The notion of let's see how governments can get in the way of industry and then impose rules to keep them from doing that is just not a great model in the tech space. We have to do much more work ex ante and get more preemptive. And what that means is to do something preemptive means first really getting together with our friends and family, our shared values partners, and working together to examine how we approach some of these issues from a policy perspective. And it doesn't mean that we will all inexorably lead to some unified approach. It is still perfectly possible and appropriate to have slightly different approaches, but I do think if we begin those conversations early with a view to facilitation and promotion of those shared values, you more naturally end up in a position of interoperability, so that you can allow for those differences in approaches within a unified framework of those shared values. Because I just think you have to, and without rushing to regulation, but actually working together to figure out where we can do that. I think those are the kinds of approaches that I think are warranted in this space. Again, I don't want to say that trade agreements aren't warranted. There's still a role for them, and we still need those rules. But we just can't wait. We have to start working on this now. Even while I know we don't have the answers. Whether it's AI or quantum, we don't know the full range of threats. We don't know the full range of policy solutions. But as friends, we can work on these together and reach, I think, a mutually kind of operable outcome.
So tremendously interesting. That kind of being preemptive as a mindset. This I think is really, really interesting. Susan, I think you wanted to come in.
Thank you very much. I think we have to acknowledge that data is something different. The data that underpins data-driven technologies, from nanobiology to VR to AI, et cetera, to bots. And it's a good and a service. We don't know when it's an import and when it's an export. We don't know how to measure it. Governments are trying. We make all sorts of estimates to its value to trade and its value to our economy. And in truth, we don't know how to do that. And Arun, I was very taken when you said we really don't know how to govern it. And that's the truth. I would say, China, the UK, have very comprehensive approaches to the various types of data governance. That said, data is a development issue. Many developing countries don't have data-driven sectors, and they need help. And that has led to their reluctance to negotiate at the WTO. I'm wondering how much everybody's thought about. eBay has this fabulous history of capacity building and showing how digital trade, well, back then e-commerce, can enhance trade. What are we all doing to help developing countries understand how to create a regulatory context, which we don't know how to do really, to foster innovation and foster good governance so that people, that we reduce risks? Nobody knows how to do it, but yet we have to help developing countries have this confidence. So why are we not working together on those things?
I think that's tremendously interesting. I think the again the mindset shift that could be achieved if we could, because it seems very clear to me that a lot of developing countries could be the greatest beneficiaries here. The leapfrog potential of this technology, the potential of very small companies to innovate and to grow. Youthful populations who can be rapid adopters and adapters of technology. But it's that crucial point that you make, which is about confidence and building confidence in some of these countries that there is a good way to govern this. And there is a good way to ensure that your economy can be globally competitive, and things like open data are going to be actually incredibly important and enabling for some of these economies as well. Darren, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, thanks. Just on this last point that you and Susan have been talking about, I think that I would agree with Susan's assessment of the situation, and with a caveat that there are things that are happening, but it's just too ad hoc at this point, and it's not consistently applied in different parts of the world. And I think that there's much work that needs to be done, including even domestically within Canada, and how we work with our development agency and their experts in terms of when they're working in terms of their official development assistance programming abroad. And this is an area where actually the US, Canada, and the UK do a lot of work. Our development agencies do actually coordinate a lot, and especially in these kind of macro contexts. But I think we have to have, a more forward-looking approach, and I can note domestically that we have more work to do in that regard, to make sure that, especially in the sectors of interest in various developing countries, that we interject, efforts at helping with digital transformation and also with building their domestic regimes to adopt these new technologies in ways that provide for an equitable distribution of income, of economic prosperity. That it's not that it's picking different winners and losers in those economies. That allows for inclusion of in some cases communities that have not had an opportunity to participate in terms of these new economies. So, and including within the context of international trade. There also has to be, I think, more to be done to demonstrate the South-South benefits that can be occurred from this. This is not about the North and the South, and this is a dynamic, unfortunately, that appears far too often in the WTO context, where we're having theological discussions as opposed to actually meaningful trade discussions. And that's part of, I think, the frustration, and I suspect why, in particularly in the private sector, the WTO gets, I would say, in some cases dismissed because we're not producing results, and we keep getting trapped in these long-standing discussions that go nowhere. And the JSI econ discussions, there's going to be another litmus test whether we can actually learn from those past mistakes and actually move forward in this respect. So I think this is another area. It's a challenge, but also an opportunity. But it's going to be multifaceted. We're going to have to do work domestically to kind of make sure that our work shifts in the right direction in that regard. There's definitely a role for the private sector and for civil society to be part of that conversation and the development of initiatives and the proliferation of balanced rules that ensure that we have the capability of dealing with, again, the market access impediments, issues that relate to facilitation, and again, consumer trust and confidence. If we take those balanced, perspective forward and build confidence that that's indeed the orientation, then I have some hope that we can do that. Otherwise, we're going to see a divide between developed and developing countries that's only going to grow and give space for alternative perspectives or visions, including that big country over in the Asia Pacific region, to expand its vision as to what one should do in this realm, and that I think is not in our collective interest.
Thanks, Darren. We're sort of approaching the last 10 minutes of this panel discussion, but it's also the last 10 minutes of a whole day's discussion on digital trade that that has brought together literally people from around the world. So I'd like to throw out a challenge to you all. As you look ahead in terms of, you're all very well aware of what's happening on the digital trade agenda, of the core issues and so on. I'd be very interested to hear from you. What's the one thing that each of you individually maybe thinks isn't being looked at, or we should be exploring in more detail, or that feels a little left field from the existing trade discussion, but maybe we could do something different. I was very interested in this idea of a sandbox mentality for the a government dialogue around these issues. I thought that was really, really interesting. Just in the last few minutes, maybe opportunity for each of you to just say, look, this is a bit new or this is a bit different, but maybe if we put a little bit of effort into this, we can make some progress. I don't know who would like to go first with that, but if there are any volunteers, or I will. Susan, thank you very much. Oh, you're on mute.
I have the luxury of being a scholar who can, think differently about these things. But I've been thinking a lot about disinformation as a trade issue, and why we only ban certain types of practices. Disinformation is often and probably primarily domestic, but it is often spread from one country to another by bots. We already banned spam. We require nations. Every single trade agreement already bans spam. It says to nations, enforce your own laws. Why not? Ask UNITRAL, the UN International something for trade law, which creates all sorts of model laws and created the global e-commerce laws, to do one on personal data protection so that we have a shared approach. I know nations have different norms and different approaches, but let's create something that can guide nations as they go about creating their international laws, and do the same for bots. Not that bots are not useful. They can be fabulous in saving time, but spam bots or bots that are used to spread disinformation should be banned under trade agreements. Okay, disinformation is a form of speech, and certain cultures are going to have a hard time regulating that at the national level. But let's find ways internationally that we can help each other. I think, there have been lots of efforts that are not coordinated with the trade regime. And I think, if COVID has taught us anything, it is how connected we really are, and that we need to work harder to come up with these kind of solutions and help other countries, because that's our future.
Very interesting. Certainly in all our discussion with policymakers and regulators, in the UK, disinformation is absolutely front of mind at the moment, and clearly one where where policymakers and legislatures are looking for solutions. Ashley, can I turn to you?
This is a tall order, but it's a great question. So two things that I don't think are terribly novel in the conversation, but I think just important points. And first is the point that I made earlier, that digital trade and trade facilitation are really one and the same for a global e-commerce company. And so as we're thinking about these issues, not forgetting the part that trade facilitation plays in opening up economic opportunity for SMEs globally. And the other issue is, I think that these issues of trust are paramount in all of these conversations, and they're conversations that we're having as a platform, and that we think are very, very important. I think that engaging with small businesses and really thinking through the impact of certain regulatory frameworks on small businesses is really important. Because obviously there can be a proclivity to over-regulate and over-legislate in the name of trust, without really thinking through what that might mean for a small player that's trying to participate. And so that's more of a plea than I think a novel concept. But it's such a great point. It's that mindset, another mindset issue, which is think like an SME, SME, again, constant theme of the conversation today. The big beneficiaries of digital trade liberalization will be SMEs. Companies can find their way through. SMEs, almost impossible for them unless they have predictability and kind of clear framework. So think like an SME, I think, is just a great mindset positioning point for thinking about this stuff. Aaron.
Well, I had to chime in here because I couldn't risk being the last word of the day and couldn't handle that pressure. So the question was tough enough without that additional pressure. I think one of the things that is interesting to consider is just how critical bridging the digital divide is to digital trade. Like even more so than in the old goods world context of widgets and things. The economic development piece of this that Susan had talked about and others had mentioned, nothing is going to happen on digital trade. We're going to get nowhere if we exacerbate the digital divide, if we don't solve for that. And so there is a chicken and egg problem here, and that we do need to push our partners and push ourselves to do better at home, and our partners to do better overseas, because without solving for that problem, without addressing that gap, we are not going to create essentially either the consumer base or the business base who are going to be the ultimate advocates for digital trade. Right? If you're not connected, if you're not online, you give a damn about e-commerce. I mean, what does Amazon mean to you? I think some of us sit here in the pandemic and have been saved by e-commerce because we've been sitting at home and had everything delivered to us. So much of the world, and including parts of the United States, do not have that option. That is a huge problem, and that also limits the potential reach of future technological advances and developments. And so you end up, if you don't solve for that underlying problem, you end up perpetuating a scenario and creating an underclass that ultimately supports a backlash against technological advancement. And that's not good for anyone. So I wonder if there's ways, and certainly I think, as I mentioned before, I'm not sure the trade agreements are the way to do it, but certainly in our dialogues with foreign governments, like bringing in the digital divide as a priority topic area, I think is something that would help us on the digital trade front.
Absolutely, as a kind of confidence building measure, and it's just like the key, isn't it? It's the key to unlock all the other good stuff. But we've got to go through that door. We can't just ignore digital divide globally as a really significant issue. Darren, I think you put your hand up, which Anthony, it does mean that you're going to be going last in terms of the pressure is on you. But Darren, over to you.
Thanks. Just very quickly, I'll put a plug in for just continuing to work on developing better policy development tools, access to and creative quantitative information so that we can make better decisions, both from a government perspective and industry and civil society. So collaboration with respect to the three countries, but also in other forums like the OECD, WTO, even APEC, critical. So I'll also put up just a plug in for continuing to work in terms of developing better tools and ability to measure the work that we're doing.
I hear trade academics around the world saying yay, and definitely in support of that point. Just better data, better quantitative analysis. So Anthony, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed. I think my gamble of going last and hoping that we'd crossed 11:30 New York time has failed. Anyway, I very much agree with everything that others on the panel have just said. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I'm going to slightly cheat, and I'm not sure these are novel, but I think sort of the three words that sort of I take away from this discussion, I think, are the key going forward, are connectivity, inclusion, and globalization. And the reason I mention those is, I think by connectivity, it's just we have to join all of these dots. We can't deal with any of these issues in isolation, which is why I think free trade agreements will have a role to play in addressing some of these issues, but they can't address all of them. Not least because, I'm not going to challenge Aaron to agree with this or disagree, but we're still waiting to see whether we're going to restart a free trade agreement with the US. And I really hope we do, and I think there's lots of positive indications that there is interest in that. But it may not happen, and therefore we can't put all our eggs in that basket. We might be able to do some of this through the GSR and e-commerce and the WTO, but that may not happen. So we can't put our eggs in that basket. So we have to identify the topics and then identify, I think we've all agreed, the fora. And then the inclusion piece is, as we've all said, it has to be inclusive within our countries, within the economy, large companies, small companies, private sector, academia, etc., etc. But then crucially, this point about the developing world, partly because these issues are going to be some of the solutions to the challenges they face, partly because if we don't help them realize the benefits of these issues that we have clearly enjoyed, then that just fosters that sense of continuing sort of divide, not just digital divide, but sort of, geo-economic and geopolitical divide. And that's not a good place to be in. And then the reason I say globalization is I think I offer this as a citizen rather than a civil servant. I think we have seen over the last 5-10 years, a waning of that instinctive sort of public support for globalization. Maybe it was never there in as much as we thought it was, but it certainly, I think, is a conversation that needs to be revisited. We need to restate the case for trade globalization, restate the case for globalization as a force for good, my ministers would say. And I think tech just runs through all of that. It is just the vital underpinning of all of this. It's not just Amazon, of course, or indeed eBay. They are fantastic success stories from whom we need to learn, especially, I think, the eBay model, if I can say. But we need to get out there, recreate the conversation, recreate the sense of trust, and show why this is the way forward. And that's what's going to sustain our open societies, our open economies, and our democracies. And that's a pretty tall order, but the challenge is there to be faced together.
I think that's look. I think that's a brilliant way of bringing us to a close. I'm really struck by we started off the conversation this morning with colleagues in Australia and Singapore and Japan, where we were very much talking about trade agreements because obviously we've either just concluded some or we're close to concluding some. But the interesting thing about those discussions was, even then, the conversation was, so, okay, how do you move beyond the trade agreement? Because actually, clearly important and very enabling as it is, actually the real opportunities are about the dialogue that can then follow. And I think, this session today has been, I think, all about dialogue and all about the importance of building dialogue around the big regulatory challenges, around how we're really going to think about and address the digital divide globally, about thinking, from the perspective of SMEs, about thinking about the big kind of security and challenges, things like disinformation. But it's all about bringing people together for dialogue. And I've been really struck by the openness of everybody that we've engaged with throughout the course of the day to having that dialogue. And it does feel like, as we come out of the pandemic, in particular, with some of the the geopolitical changes that we've seen around the world, that particularly with the nations that share these common values, there really is an opportunity to really push forward on that dialogue, and really open up some of these opportunities that can come from digital trade. So thank you to all of you. I think you brought the whole of today to a very good and natural close. You've been a fantastic panel, and thank you for getting up early, some of you, to join us. As techUK, we've published our report today on our blueprint for digital trade, but the one thing we've learned over the last few years is really getting out there, engaging, and talking to people, and sharing experience and sharing ideas really matters, and hopefully today's has contributed to that. So I'd like to thank the panel, and actually I'd like to thank everybody who's supported our event today. I'd like to thank all of the speakers who've joined us from different time zones. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Sage and EY and Google, who've helped facilitate today. Crucially, I'd like to thank our partners, the ESF, ITI, TECHNATION in Canada, and JETA, and indeed the Australian government this morning. But a huge shout out also to colleagues at DIT. As TechUK, we have a really fantastic relationship with DIT. We find it extraordinarily helpful, and Anthony, your colleagues across the departments have been extremely helpful in helping us to put today's event together. So a huge thanks to colleagues at DIT. I should also thank my colleague, all my colleagues, but I'd particularly like to thank Sabina Chufu, who is the mastermind behind today's event. And Noreen, who has been behind the scenes putting everything together. And I hope we will do this again next year, because I think such an important agenda, and I very much hope we can continue to push forward with you and really make progress on digital trade. So with that, that's really the end of the day. Thank you to everybody, and I wish you a pleasant and productive rest of the day wherever you are around the world. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.